All right, good evening, guys. Welcome to the eighth session and final session of the Elastoplast taping and movement series, brought to you by Elastoplast, obviously. All sessions are free and will be presented by industry professionals from a variety of professional sporting backgrounds and physiotherapy specialties. Thanks for attending this evening. My name's Josh Tidswell. I'm a sports physiotherapist up in Darwin. My history is basically with the AFL, North Melbourne Footy Club, but I've got a clinic up here in Darwin, Elite Physiotherapy, and I'll be presenting tonight's session on shoulder injuries and taping techniques. So this session should run for about 45 minutes. We'll have some questions at the end of it, but before we start, we've just got some housekeeping rules to go over. So we've got the team from Elastoplast controlling today's session. If you've got any questions, please put them through the message or chat forum. We've got a fair few people in on today's session, so if everyone can sort of remain mute throughout the session, put any questions that you've got up on the chat room, and then we'll address them at the end. If we don't get to all of them, if there's a lot of questions we don't get to all of them, then we'll jump in and try and get back to you either by email or Todd will sort that out from Elastoplast to hopefully answer most of your questions. Just as a final disclaimer, obviously when using any of the Elastoplast products, always read the label, follow the instructions of use, and if symptoms persist, talk to your health professional. All right, let's get into it. So shoulders is a particular area of interest of mine. We've got Isaac here helping me out with sort of demonstrating the taping. We're going to go over two key taping ideas for the shoulder. The first one we'll address is more for glenohumeral joint, and then the second one we'll address is focused on AC joint injuries. So the first thing I want you to think about before taping anyone, I think you need to have a basic anatomy knowledge. So whether you've got a poster, an anatomy app on your phone, an actual anatomical model, whatever you've got, you need to have some sort of basic knowledge of what you're taping before you decide what you're taping for and how to put on the tape. So the first one we're going to do is for glenohumeral joint instabilities or shoulder dislocations. So I think from a ball and socket joint point of view, and I've got the poster up the back here as well, we'll just have a little bit of a look. So we're talking about ball and socket joint. We're talking about joint coming out of place and trying to keep it in place. So the first thing, and I think we're all fairly aware, is that shoulder joint is a very mobile but inherently unstable joint. So it relies on a number of different structures that you can see on the side view here. It relies on a number of different structures to maintain that stability of the joint. The labrum is the deepest one, which is the ring of cartilage here. Then you've got your capsule and your glenohumeral ligaments. Then you've got your rotator cuff muscles supporting it. So any damage to the labrum or glenohumeral ligaments or capsule is going to potentially make this joint more prone to popping out. So we have to try and work out a way, and this is where the key principles of taping come into play. We have to work out a way to try and stop that or minimise the chance of that happening again. So I think historically we're all taught to put on a couple of anchors, put on the anchor around the arm, and then run a couple of strips at the front, run a couple at the top, run a couple at the back, and then lock it off. And I think the only thing or the main thing I would say about that is there's no thought to it. Like, I can't really understand how, and it doesn't matter whether you put 5 bits of tape on or 25 bits of tape. There's no real thought as to what's that actually doing. And when I've presented these sort of courses before to local sports trainers or even to other physios, there's no one really has given it any thought. So I think the biggest thing that I want you to do, and we covered it last year in the session that I did on ankles. The biggest thing I want you to think about when you're taping anything is the 5 principles that we've come up with. So the first one is purpose and knowing why. What are you taping for? The second one is picking your tape that you're going to use. Then you pick your direction that you're going to tape in. You work out which areas you want to place the tension, and then you're looking at the finished product, which includes the overwrapping stuff. So the tape we're going to use today, I've already put the Leuco wrap on Isaac's shoulders to start with. So this is your hypoallergenic tape. So that's already been applied, ready to go. For Isaac's shoulders, I'm going to use the 38mm Leuco rigid, but I've also got the 50 here, which we might do for the AC joint side. So 38mm first for the right shoulder for the glenohumeral joint. We want to put the anchor on first. The other problem that we find, so just jumping around a little bit with the generic shoulder tapes that we've all been taught, and you'll see it on footy fields in particular, you'll see it on TV. As soon as a player goes to reach out, the number one place that tape is prone to coming off is at the back. Once that tape comes loose, same as anything else, whether you're taping a knee or an ankle, once that tape comes loose, then it's probably not achieving the purpose that you set out to do in the first place. So if we're thinking the purpose for today, for Isaac, and the most common way that a shoulder is going to dislocate is anterior-inferior. And so it dislocates out in this position. Shoulder comes down and forward. So I want to try and prevent that or limit the player from getting his or her arm into that position. So if you think about, all right, well, if that's where it's most prone to getting damaged or dislocating, where are we going to take it? Where are we going to tape it, or how are we going to tape it? And so my argument is that we try and tape it into an internally rotated position. So when the player comes out to do this, they can't. So as I said, we're not going to go basic anchor and strips coming all up and crossing over the shoulder, because I would argue till it doesn't do a thing. So let's have a little bit of a think. Purpose, we want to try and stop Isaac's arm from coming out to the side here. So we still need our anchor. Coming off a bit there, sweaty darling. So we still need our anchor first. So if we use the 38mm rigid, I'll get it the right way. Here we go. So if we use the 38mm rigid, I'll always do 2 or 3 anchors to start with. There's no tension on this one. That's literally an anchor. All right. So there's our anchors. Now, I don't do a circumferential anchor around the shoulder because the way that I'm going to teach you to tape this for an anterior glenohumeral joint today only requires a finish point at the anchor on the front of the shoulder. So our start point is going to be on the lateral, almost the lateral deltoid attachment. So if for an anterior dislocation, we get the player into a little bit of abduction, neutral internal-external rotation, shoulder in a nice retracted position, I'm going to start the point of that tape right over the deltoid. Loosely, we're going to come around the top of the humerus there. So again, that's still loose. So that pretty much is your anchor around the arm. But obviously, if we do that too tight, then we're going to restrict blood flow down towards the arm. So that's kept fairly loose until we get back to this same point. Should just shuffle that way a little bit. Sorry, just turn your body. So from there, then we can add the pressure. Now, we know where the front of the humeral head is, so that's where we want to come across to. So from there, we've got our direction. Now's when we want to apply the tension. So that comes across the front of the humeral head to secure onto our anchor. So that's the first one, and then we're going to chase it again. So we're going to spread it out a little bit. Same starting point. Nice and loose around the top of the humerus. Notice we're keeping it fairly high. I don't want it down on the bicep. And again, we're coming across the front, just overlapping that first one a little bit and still covering the front of that humeral head. Third one, in this case for Isaac, will be enough. loosely around, and then spreading just a fraction higher again. Got our direction. There's no tension on it until this last part. That's when the tension comes on, and we anchor it back onto there. So now if Isaac goes to come into that, there, he's restricted. Yep. Come back down now. Just bring this a little bit closer down. So we're spread out across the front, remembering Isaac's arm was out in this position. If we have a look through the back, that's our tape there. And again, if Isaac goes to go into external rotation, he's blocked at about probably 45, 50 degrees. Yep, come back down. So the next point of that is to do your overwrap. So this is not going to come off around the arm. We've sort of locked in our anchor points around the arm. So we've got no risk of that coming off, which there is risk in the other tape that we do. So the only part that we're risking it potentially coming off is at the front, again, when the player goes to reach up high. So the way we combat that, we lock off from the front. Then I will generally put another piece of a Luco wrap across that front part. So this is more about, we've addressed those key principles to taping. This is more about keeping it on, so mid-game you're not having to do it again. Back down. And there's your tape there for an anterior dislocating shoulder. I'll usually hang on to that while the player lifts their arm a couple of times to stretch it out. Make sure it's not going to come off. There it is. Again, I'll probably cut that a little bit too long. That's for an anterior dislocating shoulder. So anterior, inferior is where we want to block. That's the position we want to block, which Isaac, you'll feel that a little bit tight. Yeah. Perfect. This is exactly what we do. We haven't restricted him too much. He's not stuck in by his side, but that's where we've blocked him from coming out to. If, and I'll just touch on this quickly, if there is an element, it's not as common, but if there is an element of posterior instability or posterior dislocation, we're generally getting that either with the arms across in front of the body and there's a force going backwards, going back up that way. Very similar tape, and I'll just put one piece on to show. But remember, for the anterior tape, just twist that one again. For the anterior tape, we started right on the lateral deltoid and went forward and around to cover the front. For the posterior tape, we do the same thing, but we're going the other way. So if we're starting pretty much the same point, loosely around the upper part of the humerus, and then coming across, and we would generally, again, do 3, maybe 4. That's where we want our tension. There's no tension or tourniquet around the upper arm. We want the tension coming across the back, and we've obviously already got the anchor there ready to lock it in. And then if we were to do a couple more of those, Isaac, even with one, will feel now that coming across into horizontal flexion is a little bit blocked. Yeah? So therefore, we're protecting right at the back of that joint. I will put a couple on just while we've got time. Yeah. So if we fan that, yeah, loosely there, get our tension once we get around the back. All right. So then again, Isaac is blocked from coming across in horizontal flexion, and he's still limited or restricted coming out into ER abduction. So that's pretty much, to me, that replaces our standard top to bottom taping. Anchor over the topper of that, to secure it, and then you fix them all over the top. Now, over the top of this, as an additional, I think, to be honest, the rigid tape is what gives you your restrictions, so that's taping for it to meet our purpose. The next part that we can do, if you're thinking or if you're concerned, I mean, rigid tape is supposed to tear when it's, like, it is easy to tear when it's put in certain positions or under certain stress. So the best way to minimise that happening is to pop something like the EAB or Elastoplast Light tape over. So we've got the 75 mil most shoulders. You'll need the 75. You can get away with a 50 mil for some smaller shoulders, but following the exact same movements, exact same direction, you just don't need any tension on it, because all your tension or your restrictions come from the 38 mil rigid underneath. So bring that across to your anchors at the front. Again, usually one is enough. And then, because we've taped posteriorly as well, cover that, and then I'll lock them off again. Two or three anchors over the top, whatever you need to cover. And then again, I would put a piece, put this one a little bit smaller. I'll put a piece over the front. And one over the back. And that finishes our glenohumeral tape. Let's have a look. So that's it from the front. And then the back. So that's my glenohumeral stability tape. The big problems, like I had said, that we had with previous taping was the tape coming off. The combination of the underwrap, the rigid, and the overwrap, you've got to try and lock it down. It needs to go on before, or well before the game. We live up in Darwin, and it's hot, and it's something that obviously sweating, etc., can make a big difference. So you've got to make sure that the patient's either just had a shower, or players just had a shower, or they're dry, their skin's dry. Get the underwrap on first, get the Luca wrap on first. Then if you give that a couple of minutes or give it a bit of a rub to warm up the glue, get that to stick first, then you can start with your anchors, etc. What else? That's probably it for the glenohumeral joint, I think. We'll go through some questions shortly, but we'll move on to the AC joint. So, do you want to come sit down the inside? I was facing here, and we'll sort of move around a little bit again. So, AC joint, not too dissimilar in terms of the starting position. Again, we've got to just warm this glue up a little bit. So, we still want our anchors. Actually, let's have a look at the anatomy first. So, AC joint's a little bit easier than the glenohumeral joint in a sense that we've just got the two bones coming together, joint capsule and ligaments keeping the two bones together at the AC joint, and then some ligaments that run down from the clavicle down to the coracoid process. And again, we've got a few more up here on. So here's some ligaments for the AC joint. Here they are intact. And then this is what happens when we damage them. So when we damage them, this is where the understanding of the anatomy is huge. So when we damage them, it stops or prevents that clavicle staying down, which is why we get that step deformity. So this is what we need to think about when we're going on to tape. This is why the basic anatomy knowledge is so crucial. So we have to think about what do we want to do if this is the case and the capsule of the AC joint has been busted and the ligaments have been damaged. What do we need to do to keep these two bones as close together as possible? And that's where this next part will come into it. So that's where it comes from, purpose. So the purpose of doing this today, let's assume Isaac's had an injury where that clavicle has popped up. We need to keep that clavicle back down. So if the clavicle's popped up relative to the acromion's going to have dropped down with the rest of the shoulder blade, given that that is the only true joint keeping the rest of this upper arm attached to the skeleton. So if that's damaged, clavicle's going to pop up, acromion sits relatively down. So we need to bring the two of them back together. And there's a few different ways or a few different components that we need to add to do that. So the first one, we'll do the anchor first up the top. For this one, again, Isaac doesn't have an AC joint injury, but if his clavicle was sitting a little bit higher, then I like to use, and we used it, I think, last year as well with the ankle, I like to use a tab tape to try and pull that down. So a big component of this is trying to get depression on the clavicle. So we don't have to worry about that with the glenohumeral tape. So our anchors just sit over nice and easy. Don't need any particular tension on that one. For the AC joint tape, I'll generally do the tab tape. So measure that first. Bring it back. We rip our little inch and a half tab. Stick that onto the front. Bring this up. So stick that onto the front there, and then that gives us a new anchor point to try and get some depression down on that clavicle. So from there, we're pulling, again, we need that tension to lock the clavicle down. So I'll do two of those. They will sit just on, show again, AC joint is here. So they will sit just medial to the AC joint. There's no point in them sitting wider than that. And if we get too far medial, we start to encroach on upper traps and brachial plexus. So we need to stay, AC joint is just there. We need to stay just medial to the AC joint. Let's chuck the second one of them on. So that's your tab there, about an inch and a half. Maybe 2 inches. There, and then we've got the downward force. So that's where the tension comes into it. So that definitely acts as an anchor for the next part of our taping, but it also acts as that downward force on the clavicle. Try to get that on. So that's pulling that clavicle down here. Yeah. Now the next component, we're going to come from the side and we're going to lift the acromial side up. So they're the two components. Clavicle comes down, acromion comes up. So we can run more of the hyperfix around the arm. Just for the sake of today's taping, I won't do that. But again, a very loose anchor just to start our next points that are going to pull that arm up. For this one, I might use the 50. Again, personal choice where you want the 38 or the 50. 50 is just going to be a little bit easier. I probably only want 2, maybe 3 pieces of this tape. So if we start that one centrally, this tension's crucial. So this is going straight up, and I'll generally, one, it helps stick it to the anchor. I'll generally hold that and then help lift the arm up towards the neck. So that is quite tight, and you'll already see some creases start to develop even just after one. So we've really anchored that and pulled straight up over the top of the AC joint, which we know is already, the clavicle part at least, is already being held down by the first two anchors. And then we're going to add two more. Get one coming from the front. Again, that upward force. And then one from the back. Then we can lock it off. Again, I'll use the 38 just because I used it earlier. And then, again, locking off your anchors up the top. If you want to do an overwrap with this one, then you can. I don't think this is as crucial to do an overwrap as the glenohumeral joint. Not much of that is going to tear, but if you wanted to, or you just wanted to lock it in even further, then you do a similar sort of thing to what we did on the right shoulder. Start it in the middle, wrap it around, nice and loose, and then bring it up. This time it'll sit a little bit higher. We won't come as far forward. It's a bit hard to see there. We won't come as far forward. We'll sit up a little bit higher. I'll bring the camera up again in a second. And again, it doesn't have to be a whole heap of attention to that. That's just to offer reinforcement to the rigid tape. So one at the front. One at the back. The anchors to lock it off. And there's your AC joint tape. So you can see we haven't had to come as far forward or as low at the front or at the back. We're not covering across the back of the joint, which we did on the other side. So there's your AC joint tape. All right. Any questions on the tapes that we've just done? Flick them through or put them onto the chat, and we can have a bit of a talk. Probably particularly for the glenohumeral one. The AC joint one, I think, is fairly self-explanatory. Maybe a couple of extra bits and pieces, or a little bit of different thought pattern. Again, I'd probably go ahead and chuck some more of the under wrap over the front of that just to keep that sticking down. But adhesive spray, what do you use for skin prep? I don't use an adhesive spray. Again, I don't have anything against it, but I generally find that the under wrap works best, and especially if you get it on early enough before the game, then that once that glue sort of melts a bit and sticks to the skin, then that seems to work best to keep the tape on. So yeah, personally don't use an adhesive spray. Do you find shorter anchors on the AC joint taping peel back? The little tab bits that I put on, is that what we mean for the anchors? because the anchors over the top of the shoulder we keep the same. They're just not. So, sorry, Nicole, do you mean like the small tab bits that we put on that anchor over the chest? No, so same deal with the longitudinal strips. Like, so the main anchor that I'll put over the top, just do this way, does it? So the main anchor that we put over the top is still a similar sort of length, I guess, as the ones for the glenohumeral, but we put the short tab tapes there, which just help us get a bit more of that downward force over the top of the shoulder. So the actual anchors themselves, I wouldn't make any shorter. The only difference is those little bits of and look, that's a personal preference. That's just something that I found works well when going back to what we're thinking about. Look, what's my purpose? My purpose is hold that collarbone down as much as I can. And you'll just find a lot of people will just rip their anchor, go up to the top of the shoulder, if it was, do the AC, and just pop it on like that. And I guarantee it's not going to do a thing. So at least if there's a little bit of thought to it, put that little tab bit down and actually get some extra downward force on that anchor. It serves that purpose for the AC joint instabilities. Anchors around the chest, there's 100%, there's different ways that you can try and anchor that. And whatever works for you and whatever's worked for you in the past, do it. I've seen people wrap the Luco wrap all the way around the chest and then chase that with rigid tape. I mean, where do you end? At some point, it's got to have an end point. If that's what works for you, then I guess that's fine. I've found athletes generally don't like that restriction. Like, if you can't afford to do it too tight around the chest wall, and obviously once athletes are actually in the game and breathing heavily and wanting that chest expansion, I've found athletes don't like that very much at all. I've seen people follow this overwrap around underneath the other armpit and back around the back. But again, once people start moving their arms, or particularly with footy where you're trying to catch overhead, it doesn't work. Again, routinely, with hand on hip or position of taping. I prefer to tape it in sort of a neutral internal external rotation position, and with the arm in about somewhere from 30 to probably 45, 50 degrees of abduction. Definitely have seen before, probably sports trainers more so. I don't know who sort of pushes or likes that position. I don't love the position when most people come into that position. So I tape it here. When most people come into hand on hip position, they end up in that sort of forward humeral head position, which is not a great position to tape it in. I'd rather tape in as anatomically neutral position as possible, which the player's going to be able to hold their own arm up for 2-3 minutes. That's probably the best position, I think, to tape it in. But look, if they can hold that position without getting too much forward humeral head position, then fine. Yep. So taping tips for when taping a female shoulder and advice. That can be a tricky one. And definitely something we have to be aware and cautious of. A lot of women will wear sports tops or what have you, but they can use a towel or something to cover themselves up. Perhaps if it is if you are a male sports trainer, or if there is any concern, having an extra person in the room is probably a smart one. But generally speaking, they'll have a towel or another top that they can hold over to cover themselves up and still allow you freedom of access to this area. Obviously, even with sports bra straps, they may need to have already pre-prepared, have the arm out of that, and then again just have a towel covering themselves up here. Top 5 tips for shoulder taping to take away from tonight. Number one is just still think about your purpose. Like, I think when you're taping anything, you need to think about why you're taping it and how you can best how you can get the most out of what you're trying to take. I think there's too many people, and that's physio, sports trainers. It doesn't individualise one group, but there's too many people that just tape something because that's how they've seen it taped, or they've watched a YouTube channel, or that's how another sports trainer taught them. Now, while there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, I think it's a smarter or a better idea, whether you're taping a shoulder, whether you're taping something a lot more simple like an ankle or a thumb. Just think about what you're taping for, what you're trying to block, where you need that tension on the tape. Think about comfort of the athlete, so you're not sort of restricting blood flow to the arm or to the foot if it is a knee or something like that. But number one is purpose. The taping has to have a purpose. And if you get the purpose right and you know some basic anatomy, then you can start to think about how you can tape to better restrict or prevent, because that's the biggest thing when we're doing rigid taping, is we're trying to prevent that patient from having further injuries. So if we're wanting that patient to not roll an ankle, then we've got to tape it in a certain way so they don't roll their ankle. If we want that player or patient to not dislocate their shoulder, and we know that that's the position that they're likely to dislocate it, work out how you can limit them getting into that position without necessarily limiting what they need to do for a sport, which, let's say footy again, for example. Isaac could be more than able to catch a ball out in front here, but coming out here is going to be a lot harder for him. So find your purpose, make sure that you've got the right tape. There's a lot of tapes on the market, and a lot of them inferior to others. So make sure you've got a good tape. The Luca or Elasto range, from my point of view, and Todd knows I've used for 15 years, and I wouldn't use any other tape. So make sure that you have the right tape. Make sure you select the right tape options within a range. The EAB, obviously, as an overwrap is much smarter to use than a hand tearable. So there's no point putting that on as an overwrap when it tears itself. The idea of an overwrap is to support or protect your rigid taping. Any other questions? I think that's probably it. We'll wrap it up. If there are any other questions, feel free to flick them through to Todd at Elastoplast. This video will be available for access, I think, probably tonight or tomorrow. So thanks very much for coming and listening in over the last 8 weeks. Please keep an eye out for our Elastoplast social media channels for any upcoming events and to view their product range. Remember, you can head to elastoplastsport.com. Thanks very much. Have a good night.